In less than 1.5 weeks from now, the pencils will be put down, the laptops will be closed, and NFL mock drafters will have their work checked against the real thing. The foremost authority on mock drafts, Benjamin Robinson from Grinding the Mocks, is here to go over his latest prognostications. Benjamin, why in the world are you dressed up more fancifully than I, given that I am the host of this pod?
You have the classy voice. I gotta have the classy get up. I think that's the way, I gotta
Okay.
match, I gotta find a way to match your energy.
It's very Taoist of you, the yin and the yang. I have this one thing, you've got this. Okay, I get it. That's fair.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, you got it. It's fascinating because, I've certainly been digesting as much draft coverage as I possibly can within reason, as have you. And as you go, so goes the rest of the football community. Because I think one of the things that we talked about that was really important in our last episode was the real problems with measurement technology at the combine. And fans and pundits have been talking about short arms and 40 times and such a great deal more than they normally would. And what I am noticing is that experts and fans alike are treating these data as fact. And perhaps we shouldn't, which means the work is never done, right?
Yeah, I agreed. There's a really nice piece that my friend Sam Hoppin wrote on his Substack Hop into Conclusions that I linked in one of my last Substack posts, um, where he kind of did an exercise and maybe like what some of your students in sports analytics will know as bootstrapping, which is basically repeated sampling. And he watched Kenyon Sadiq's 40-yard dash and hand timed it a number of different times and looked at the distribution of results. And so a lot of people think that what you said is true, which is that the data represents reality. But the smart, statistically minded folks will know that it's just a representation of reality in that moment. It's a sampling from the distribution. And so people don't kind of realize that, but they're doing that even when they're watching film. You're choosing to look at a sample of that player's game to see if it's the true representation of their actual skill set. And I was actually like kind of like fake, not really arguing, but playing a little bit of devil's advocate on Twitter the other day, talking about that, which is, how do you know enough games is enough? You've watched 4 games of Jeremiah Love, so he's good, but did you watch his 4 best games? Did you watch some of his 4 worst games? How many plays do you need to watch to feel like you get a representation of his skill set? Not everybody has, access. We'd call that a maybe like a heuristic sample in the statistical lingo. But folks should acknowledge that. I was even seeing some people talking about the Toledo safety, Emmanuel McNeil Warren, and someone said, I've watched 4 games. I don't see it. Which game should I watch so I can see what other people are seeing? And they're like, oh, yeah, watch the Miami of Ohio game. Okay, I'll do that. I'm like, well, whoa, wait a second. Hey,
You
what's
just
what's going
replace
on
bias with
here?
bias.
Yeah, exactly. You're just biasing your already biased stuff. But like, not everybody thinks about this from like a power rule perspective about like how much data do I need to actually make sure that I'm seeing a representation. Is it a random sample? Don't think so. Your PFF Ultimates of the world might be able to do that depending on how with it the PFF Ultimate product team is these days, given the state of the world. But yeah, these are all like actually like really nuanced, important concepts that are getting surfaced a little bit more, but people are probably aren't realizing it.
A friend of mine told me a long time ago that when you break down if you're going to be, more of an English major or more of a math major when you're going to college and figuring out what path you want to take, that oftentimes how much you crave the truth and concrete ideas will have a lot to do with which direction you take. And I think especially when it comes to the math and quants among us, we do this because we want to get closer to the truth, right? We're not really big into philosophizing necessarily. We're not really big into the abstract. We want concrete answers to things. And unfortunately, the way we go about something as simple as measuring someone's arm or how we time how fast they run, those things still have distributions. There's still ranges. And I think it's probably one of the reasons why we suddenly want to believe that these are facts and we fall back on that bias because we don't want to believe in ranges. We don't want to believe in variance, even though it's just like everything else.
It's so true. I mean, just think about weight. If you weigh yourself every day, do you weigh yourself at the same time? Do you weigh yourself like, come on, this stuff
Yeah.
varies day to day. You know, Spencer Fano's not, to be 320 pounds or whatever he was at the combine every day. It'll vary. And so the question is like, what does his mean? And what does that actually, in that way, what does it actually mean
Mhm.
for him as a prospect? And that's why we like the combine because they're all kind of getting measured in a standardized way at the same time in the same place. Technically they're kind of in the same environment. So like, we kind of care about those things. But in reality, these numbers are not, they're not always what you think they are.
Fair enough. Let's get into your latest aggregate mock draft. Clumping around picks 5 through 8. We've got Carnell Tate. We've got Ruben Bain. We've got Sonny Styles in that mix. Is it unusual this late to have this kind of clumping near the top of the board? And does it typically resolve before the draft? Or do teams just sort of pick the board and the thing scrambles in real time?
I think I don't know the answer to that specifically, but I do think it's pretty normal for there to be some amount of uncertainty. I think in this class specifically, there's not a lot of news happening really. In the past, you would hear like this guy had his pro day, and we talked about pro days last time and about how I don't really think they matter. You know, Even when there were some pro days, like there were very few that mattered. So I don't think there's a lot of real stuff happening at this moment. It's a true kind of dead period. And we're not like there's not all these quarterbacks that you're trying to buy into the pro day hype for. I think like when I think about the guys who had like meaningful pro days, I think of like Jermod McCoy, the cornerback from Tennessee, who had a lot of injury questions and didn't work at the combine, and he had committed to the Senior Bowl and didn't end up going there. And you know, for him, it's like, yeah, yeah, great that you ran well. Avion Terrell, the cornerback out of Clemson, had a injury issue. His pro day means something. Like maybe it's probably downgrading his stock a bit. Um, so I just think there's kind of just a lack of stuff to hold on to. So for the most part, people are kind of staying steady. When I wrote my latest risers and fallers article, I was looking back at my last data update and what my numbers were at that update and then what they were a week ago before I published the new update today. And they basically for the most part held the same for everybody. And I'm like, well, that's not really an interesting article then. Some of the ranks might have changed, but the actual averages, the expected draft positions were pretty much the same. So I decided to look back at the combine to provide a little more time for us to see what was going on in those players' numbers. And that's what the latest risers and fallers piece that I wrote in my Substack was about. But I do think that there's a fair amount of uncertainty because of some of it has to do, I think, with the quarterbacks. Um, Normally you can be like, yeah, we're going to peg a quarterback here. It can be like pretty clear which team needs a quarterback, and then you're just thinking about which one. But yeah, I think there is some amount of clumping, but I don't know if there's more clumping than usual or if it's also like an artifact of some of the weighting systems that I use, where mock drafts that are out today are worth zero point 0.1 mock drafts. And so we're really kind of beginning to ramp up the value of the information that's being fed into the grinding the mocks models.
Does it feel like that we've sort of put the combine behind us, that it gave, bumps to certain players, but now that we've had some time to digest that maybe on the whole we've overemphasized what the combine provided?
Potentially. So, I mean, when I look at my biggest fallers in the data, they're all the big combine stars. So, Sonny Styles, Dylan Thieneman, and Kenyon Sadiq were two of my biggest fallers since the combine. And Styles and Thieneman were two of my biggest risers coming out of the combine. So, like, what does that say? It says that the combine surfaced their athleticism, and we kind of got to see what their ceilings were a little bit more than what where we were maybe before at some of their floors. And so, I think for some players, yeah, it'll kind of emphasize like, hey, like we think this player could be at this ceiling. But then as things kind of come back to earth a little bit, we say, hey, actually, it's kind of more somewhere in the middle. Thieneman likely isn't a top half of the first round guy, but that might be more of his ceiling. And then, you know, everything else will kind of play out with Styles. They were saying, oh, is he top five? Maybe borderline top five, now securely top 10. And then you know, for Sadiq, I think we'll talk about him later. Unquestionable athleticism. What were people seeing before that they weren't seeing now? it should have been pretty apparent that he was a really good athlete. And even despite that, people were still grading him in the second half of the first round, not in the first half. So at first he gets a bump where he's like maybe in consideration at, the most maybe at pick 14 with the Ravens. If that's his ceiling, then that's probably not where he's going to show up in the averages in grinding the Mock's expected draft position. So for me, it's exciting because it tells us a bit about what these players' ceilings might be. Um, for ones that we didn't know how good athletes they were, but for others, it probably, you're probably not hearing as much about how some of the bad players are doing outside of the top 32 on my site. And for others, just a kind of a wake-up call for like the Baines and the Fanos. They kind of are tending to not regress to their former levels. They're tending to kind of say like, hey, like with this information, this is their new normal. So that's sort of what I think about it when I think about the combine does. It kind of provides a little bit more of a level expectation for some of the outliers athletically and physically. And then for those that had this like very outlier testing in a positive way, it shows us their ceiling, but probably going to see some regression.
Well, let's talk about Sadiq, since you brought him up. Historically great combine, still mid first. Is this a tight end tax?
It could be. I think when we look at some of the, draft experts who like don't just rank players within a draft class, but give you grades from year to year, you see Sadiq who's in the like top, he's in that top group with the like he's behind the Kyle Pittses of the world, behind the Tyler Warrens, behind the Brock Bowers, behind the Colston Lovelands. So those guys went in the top half of the first rounds, and it seems that for him, he's in that group, but the production just wasn't as good. But the athleticism is really great. And so, almost better than, maybe better than Vernon Davis in terms of a performance by a tight end at the NFL Combine. So I think in a class where the receiving options are as deep as they are, that also could have an impact. And then I do think that for some of the more athletic projection tight ends, you've been disappointed, like in the Kyle Pittses of the world, whereas the Brock Bowers and the Colston Lovelands and Tyler Warrens maybe they didn't like wow you athletically, but their production was really, really good, and their athleticism was nice as well. I think he has more of the athletic traits than the production traits. And so I think if he had more of the production traits, people were talking about Kyle Pitts when he was coming out as like a wide receiver. And when that was happening, he went before Jamar Chase. I was like, well, if you're going to pick him before Jamar Chase, you need to treat him like a wide receiver in your offense. And that just has never materialized in a consistent way. And so maybe teams are wising up to that, but teams have consistently taken tight ends pretty highly in the draft, just specific ones.
If we're not making fun of the Atlanta Falcons draft history, then what are we even doing?
Every now and then you look at the, who survives? Is it the coach or, is it the general manager? And for a while I was, how can how can Terry Fontenot keep getting away with this? And there's a concept in soccer analytics popularized by a former athletic writer named John Mueller, which was don't fire the coach, fire the sporting director. And oftentimes the coaches get much shorter leashes than the general managers do, especially in football. And I think Fontenot definitely stayed a little longer than he probably should have, given the state of where the team is now. And
Mhm.
now Matty Ice, figurehead, is involved, and Ian Cunningham, who's technically the guy actually doing the stuff, except on paper. Um, in Atlanta has some cleaning up to do. But yeah, they did made a lot of questionable positional value picks over the years, except for Michael Penix, but that was
Right.
more of a stacking issue in my mind.
Exactly, exactly. And we'll see if the adults are finally in the room in Atlanta, and we'll see what happens going forward with them. How about we move on now to Carnell Tate, the Ohio State wide receiver, jumping from 9 overall to 5 overall. That is significant, and I am curious if this is team interest driving this expected draft position, or something in his film or measurables that got reassessed.
I think there was some amount of questionable. Um, his 40-yard dash time was like not as high as you would want it to be for somebody who's more of a vertical stretch the field wide receiver. Um, so, his special ability, the Sumer sports people have these different Sumer scores for different receiver traits, and he's like a 10 at vertical routes. So for somebody who's supposed to be really good at the vertical stuff, you would kind of hope that maybe he ran a little bit better. But I think after the combine, he didn't ever fall out of being wide receiver one. I think he went from being in consideration maybe like pretty often in the top five, to being like, well, maybe more like in the top 10. Like the Chiefs might be his floor versus the Giants being his ceiling. And so it was somewhere in between, and I think he was kind of getting pushed down towards the Chiefs more due to some of that. And I think then reassessing the wide receiver class, he's separated himself. I think some of it is team interest, but I think a decent amount of it is just reassessing the tape and just saying, hey, like, is he actually like, does that testing factor play into what I think about his evaluation? I think the resounding answer is no. No other receiver has come close to catching him in terms of who the top receiver is. Um, I will say that his NGS next gen stats draft score is actually not that good. Which is, surprising for a prospect like him. And, when you go on the NFL.com website and look at his numbers, you kind of are wondering like what's the disconnect there? And it seems to me that they just like his projection better for some reason. So I'm not actually sure that he is a better wide receiver than Makai Lemon or Jordan Tyson. Um, but scouts definitely and teams definitely think he is, and so that's going to play a big role. The landing spot looks like it could be, like I said, pick five overall, pick four overall could be like the real ceiling, depending on what goes on with the Titans there. If they really are zeroed in on Jeremiah Love, or if they're open to Carnell Tate as an option for their offense. So I think 4 or 5 is like the ceiling, and now it seems like the Chiefs are definitely kind of on the low end of where he could go.
If being from Ohio State has anything to do with it, I mean, you would expect even more hype around him, given just the pedigree, what he was able to show, for the biggest program and coming through in massive games. I figured that had something to do with, being ranked highly, but
Yeah.
still, though, to have those expectations tempered feels like it should almost be in the opposite direction.
You would think, I think that there's a lot of issues analyzing some of the pieces of the Ohio State offense. And it's not about the quarterback, it's about their number one wide receiver, Jeremiah Smith, who, is likely to be a top 5 pick in next year's draft. He probably would be the wide receiver one in this year's draft. And you can make that kind of excuse for like almost every pass catcher on the Ohio State offense. Oh, but he was playing with Jeremiah Smith. Carnell Tate, the Ohio State tight end, the Purdue transfer, Max Clare, everyone is basically saying, well, their production, but look at Jeremiah Smith. He's there. And so to me, you'd want someone to be a little bit more involved in the offense. It wasn't like, when Ohio State had Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave and Jackson Smith and Jigba and Emeka Egbuka on the offense. It was an alpha. And so, I think people like his film a lot, but you don't necessarily see that translate into the production that you would like to see for a guy that you're picking potentially in the top 5. And so, when I think about the guy whose film and the production matches more, it's Makai Lemon. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a USC alum from my master's degree, Fight On Grow Trojans, but the that's sort of the disconnect right now in analytics community around Carnell Tate. The film loves him. He has some good metrics, like the go ball vertical route stuff is really good. That's also not necessarily the in vogue style of play to beat the kinds of defenses that teams are running these days. That's, the Puka Nakuas, the Amon-Ra St. Browns, those Jackson Smith and Jigbas are not those vertical down the field getting big chunk plays all the time because, the cover two safety look has taken away those looks, and focused on making teams beat you, more through yards after contact and such, yards after catch, and that's not Carnell Tate's game. But everyone loves what he brings to the table. The premier, film analysts out there think very highly of him. So it's just the data that has a questionable take on him, and I think some of it is due to environment, but some of it you'd want a little more out of a guy going in the top 5, or a lot more.
Absolutely. And again, you don't want to sort of go on fit too often because sometimes if you're just that talented, then it's up to you to figure out how to make it work. At the same time, when literally the entire league is forcing offenses to be way more methodical, that has to matter in this conversation. And it's also why, when we were talking about tight ends a minute ago, why you can kind of understand why someone might overvalue a tight end because that's kind of how that's what defenses are giving you, right? And
Yeah.
so some mistakes may be more forgivable when at least you understand what the league is trying to force you to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. And then, also I will say that in the past, when there are guys who that's their only, like that's their one trick is the deep stuff, like the Xavier Worthies, um, you know, they tend to get drafted later. It tends to impact their draft capital more than their actual production. But Carnell Tate, they believe he can do all the other stuff. They believe that he's not a one trick guy. But that's But yeah, he did it really well at Ohio State. That's what he was asked to do. They
Mhm.
believe that he can do a lot more. So, when I think about the team fits, in Tennessee, he would walk in and be the number one wide receiver there. In New York, he would walk in the Giants. He would walk in there and he'd be the second wide receiver beside Malik Neighbors. If he walks into the Saints receiver room, he'd be the wide receiver two next to Olave. If he walks into the Chiefs wide receiver room, he would probably be the wide receiver one there alongside all their other, maybe wide receiver two alongside Rashee Rice,
Mhm.
and then eventually replace him.
1B, yeah.
Yeah, so I think depending on the landing spot, you might be a little more bullish or not. I think the a real strong possibility could be the Browns, where he would definitely be the wide receiver one, and the only question is could Shador Sanders get the ball to him? But there's a lot of really interesting landing spots for Carnell Tate. I think he's someone that I'll be really excited about, depending on finding out where he goes.
As far as the draft happening next week, is there another player whose final landing spot you're most uncertain about and why?
Right now, I think Ruben Bain. Recently there was some information that came out that the public was unaware of, but teams have apparently known about for a while, which is a tragic car crash that he was the driver in that um, someone died from. And so I think that leads some teams to question like the public really, not the teams, the public to kind of question, what gives there. And so I think that'll fade away eventually. But I think even now post combine, when I look at his expected draft position and grinding the mocks, it's barely top 10. Expected draft position of 9.3. So to me, the question is that his floor or is his floor lower? And so that's the big question. Um, when the last time there was someone at this like kind of place in the draft that had these kind of character questions that I can think of, it's Jalen Carter. And there was no question about Jalen Carter's measurables. Um, and so there was more of a question of his off the field character. And he ended up falling a little bit based on if you looked at his big board ratings versus, just looking at the talent versus expected fit, like where he's going to go in the draft. There was a disconnect there. With Bane, I see a similar disconnect, but people have a lot more questions about the physical profile, the outlier nature, the smaller arms, the stuff that we've talked about that's real, the athleticism, that, he wins in different ways than a lot of like the more traditional edge rushers we think they win. Um, I still like Ruben Bane a lot as a player. And if teams are comfortable with this, then maybe he'll go higher than people think. But I've seen people say that, maybe his floor now is the Ravens. And so to me, if he ends up falling outside of the top 10, that's to me that's kind of an interesting scenario. And we'll see how many of the like leading, draft nicks out there are going to follow that logic. I could definitely see him being available at, 9 and the Chiefs kind of, taking that risk or the Saints. But if those teams decide, hey, like we're going to go in a different direction, then, who knows? Maybe the Ravens do end up making kind of that classic Ravens pick where they kind of take a player who's really good that falls to them because of other considerations.
When it comes to all of the new mock drafts that will be coming out over the next several days, is there one particular day or time, or maybe even group, where you are getting true, meaningful information? And then at what point in this process between now and next Thursday when it just becomes noise?
So to me, right now people there's a lot of like echoing of what they're hearing from people who they trust, like, the Daniel Jeremiahs of the world, the Peter Schrager's of the world, maybe from some of the like more breaking news reporters like Adam Schefter and stuff like that. Um, a lot of the times, the best draftniks will put out their mocks like the day before the draft or the day of, and at that point, people will have very little time to react, and so you run into kind of very fast rising players. There's been some like interesting like fast rising offensive linemen in the past few drafts. You go back to like Paris Johnson from Ohio State, who went a lot earlier than people thought. JC Latham, there was like a lot of the thought that the Chargers were going to draft him. Turned out the Chargers were only interested in Joe Alt, and but he still had like a big rise from where people thought he would be more in the second half of the draft to the first half. And then last year you had the Texas offensive tackle, Kelvin Banks. This year that's Caden Proctor, the offensive tackle, the mammoth offensive tackle from Alabama. And so I find him to be really intriguing. That's somebody who I think I'll be looking at mock drafts from some of these really well-sourced people and seeing, is this just a bunch of, agent talk, or is that something that's actually happening? That'll be really interesting because it would be really out of character for the Browns to pick a player who's not ranked as that high at the position they are in the draft. They tend to like to pick players around the consensus value, and they tend to like, they like the kind of player that Proctor is, young and talented. He is a big guy, really big. And so one of the questions is he too big? Does that influence his actual ability on the field? Um, the Browns have a really big lineman, Dewan Jones from Ohio State, who went a lot later than people had thought. I think in part due to some of the issues and concerns about a little bit about his play, but also about his size. There's just very few players who are like that. It's another kind of outlier issue, but on the opposite end. Not sometimes you think outlier and it's not enough. It's always you want more. In this case, I think the outlier could be too much for Caden Proctor. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of noise next week, and I'm capturing it because I'm definitely wanting to include that in my model. But yeah, the best mock drafters will be putting theirs out like the Wednesday, the day before the draft, and then a bunch on Thursday too. And those will get captured and highlighted the most in my model.
Fantastic. And as always, tell us where we can find your work.
Oh yeah. So yeah, grindingthemocks.com. That's where you can find the top 32, the horizontal and vertical board, the player charts, and some of the team tables that I have up there. You can also find some of that data in NFL IQ, so NFL.com/IQ. They released the NGS team released the Ask IQ feature this week, which is a chatbot feature where you can ask it questions about prospects in the draft that has my data in the back end there, and they'll be releasing some more draft features next week before the draft, so that should be really exciting. And then on top of that, the Substack of course, grindingthemocks.substack.com. I have a few more pieces in me next week. The final mock draft, my top 100 big board, and then a little piece on some of the players who I think are likely to be the five players that I think will be outside of the first round that are in my top 32, and the five that will be inside of it. And we'll be using some decision tree machine learning analysis to showcase how we can use some of the aggregate data to find signal on which of these players are more likely than not to fall outside of that top 32, and which ones will be inside as well. And you can do that with the top 100 too. But yeah, that'll all be on the Substack next week.
You always know the right words and phrases to use to really get me going. Like it's not just, obviously everything we talk about is great, but you start making decision tree and machine learning, then
I aim to
absolutely.
please. Yeah.
And you will wedge us in for next
Yeah.
week.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Okay.
100%. Yeah, we'll definitely have
Awesome.
a time and I'll make sure that no one else can take it.
Appreciate that. Appreciate that. Benjamin Robinson of grindingthemox.com. Thank you so much for your time as always.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Edward.